Hello everyone and welcome to Module 3, Week 3. So there's 5 lecturettes in this section and they should all tie together relatively cohesively, and they should also tie to what we've been looking at before. So I hope the course is going well for you at this point. Basically think about this, we're about halfway through by the time you get halfway through these 3 point-blank lecturettes. So we're going to talk stereotyping, but before we can talk stereotyping we really need to emphasize the process of categorization. And when we look at categorization, obviously as critical thinkers and consequentialists, if you like that word, we need to look at the potential effect, the consequences of categorization. So when we look at categorization, straightforward process. We encounter a stimuli and we automatically put that into a category. And categorization starts from the time we're essentially infants. We need to create categories so we can create associations, so we can understand, we can make sense of our world, and we can possibly predict what's going to happen next. Think about it. Coming out of infancy, what are some of the categories that we adopt, right? One of the primary categories we adopt is mom and dad. And that category then expands to male versus female, depending on our culture, but for straight up Western culture, that would be typically the process. So we encounter the stimuli, whatever it is, and we put it into a category. And the categorization pulls in as much as it can to a given category. And this is why once we learn grandpa, right, we see another man out on the street with a gray beard or whatever, and we might call that person grandpa as well. Grandpa then represents the category, and the child, the toddler, is pulling in as much as they can to the category. This just makes sense because if you have too many categories, it's just like dealing with individuals and you don't realize any of the benefits of categorization. So categories do facilitate associations. So once we put something into a category, any associates that exist in that category kind of get linked to the new item or the new member that was placed into that category. Oops. Let's not do that anymore. And then categories saturate the contents with the same ideational and emotional flavor. So not only is the ideas associated in that category associated to a new category membership, but if we have any kind of evaluation, and this is where the persuasion aspect comes in, or the attitude aspect, that is that we have negative or positive evaluations that might now be associated to the category member, as well as emotional states. And then category contents may be evaluated as more or less rational. And this is where it gets tricky, because categories can be useful and they can be very important to us, but they can also be distorted and have content that doesn't serve us well. So we have the potential for either way to go there. And let's return to this idea of categorization and the idea of the cognitive miser. Fisk and Taylor describe humans as information processors, but as cognitive misers. That is, wanting to expend as little mental effort as possible to get the job done. Now we're going to find that there are exceptions to this. When we look at need for cognition, this will be a glaring exception to this. Some people like to think and are less cognitive misers than others. But in general, and we know that's the way social psychology likes to talk, we talk in terms of averages, an overall picture of human behavior and human cognition. So when people attempt to make sense of their world, they tend to employ as few cognitive resources as possible as a result of this cognitive miserlessness. Now we're going to talk about the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion in a subsequent module. I want to talk about Shelley Chaikin for just a moment, who developed what she called the heuristic systematic information processing model as a model of persuasion. We're not going to talk about that model of persuasion. It didn't catch on. The ELM caught on, the elaboration likelihood model caught on, and the HSM kind of just faded away, although they're extremely similar. But one idea that Chaikin was advancing along with her HSM was the sufficiency principle. And this is, she suggests that people think as much as they believe they need to, and they already have preset goals of how much they want to think. Once they get to that preset goal, they stop thinking about the issue and ultimately make a decision. And I think that's a fascinating concept. And if we go back to our social cognition modules, think about David Dunning when he was talking about the executive. Who decides when enough thinking is enough, right? And that would be the executive operating, if you want to tie these together, to the sufficiency efficiency principle. Obviously, Penelope's making her appearance here, and notice there's no cone on Penelope. She got her cone off yesterday. She's really happy. Her eye is fully healed, or her lack of eye, so she's good to go now, and she's feeling it. She's been crazy last night and today, so she's really happy not to have that cone that she had to wear for a month. Let's talk about stereotypes then, because stereotypes are categories, right? They're essentially person categories, if you will. We could expand on that a little bit, but that's enough for now. They're mental representations of social categories containing a mix of abstract knowledge. So that is part of the idea, is when we create a category, it has knowledge about the category members within that category. And then also it has this unique feature of having examples. Now the fancy term is exemplars of group members. So if I was to use an easy one like dictators, for most people Hitler pops to mind right off the bat. Dictators have a bunch of qualities. They could be ruthless, they're authoritarian, right? They don't care about people to any great extent. They care about themselves, and then we have examples. So in this case, Hitler would be a great exemplar in the category of dictators, right? Now stereotypes are tricky. We got an image here, and I know this is not necessarily nice or polite, but this is social psychology, and we have to bring it to a point. So if I told you about my buddy here, what might, upon seeing my buddy Cletus, if you will, what might pop to mind? That is, into what category is he placed, and then what category contents are assigned to Cletus? So I could ask you questions about, what do you think about Cletus's dental hygiene? And I know many of you are probably snickering now, and remember, stereotypes are the basis of a tremendous number of jokes, right? And Freud talked about this as well. We say joking so that we don't have to own it, but it's hard not to be amused by these things. Take your own judgment on that as you will. What kind of car does Cletus drive, right? What's his relationship to his family? What's his likely occupation? And notice that things pop to mind as I ask these questions on the basis of Cletus's category membership, the category to which you've assigned Cletus. And let's poke fun on another one, since we're largely a college audience. And again, this is kind of over the top, but what do we say about our young lady here, right? Our sorority slut Barbie. And then once you say, okay, well, she's a college student, but notice that's one category. Then there can be a subcategory of fraternity or sorority members, or athletes, or wherever you want to go. And as you place people into these narrower categories, we often operate with greater certainty about what they're like on the basis of that, and that's tied back to their associations. So often the source of humor, but often the source of possibly a great deal of pain if you're the one who's being stereotyped. Regardless, we categorize. When we categorize people, we're really involved in the process of stereotyping to a certain degree, not treating people as individuals necessarily, and allowing the category contents to saturate them. And you might have attitudes, positive or negative, attitudes positive or negative. Remember, that's part of the categorization process as well. Now, I want to talk about an attitude-belief distinction, because we've been talking about beliefs as possessions with the endowment effect, and how that's going to affect attitudes is a large part of what we're talking about in this particular module, the 3.1 through 3.5. I want to talk about Gordon Allport. If I was to have one complaint about our open source textbook, is there was virtually no mention of Allport, and I think Allport had some of the most profound theoretical statements about prejudice, and we'll take a look at that, a couple of these throughout the rest of this. So without some generalized beliefs concerning a group as a whole, a hostile attitude could not be sustained. And let's hang on to that idea, because beliefs are possessions, right? And we value our possessions via the endowment effect, and notice that hostility can be the result of negative beliefs about a group of people and or a group of or a person, right? So it's the sustenance of these beliefs that becomes of interest to people who study social cognition. And I'll talk about some research I've done that can shed some light on that. All right, so an example of an attitude might be, I wouldn't live in a house with Jews, right? An example of the belief, there are a few exceptions, but in general Jews are pretty much alike, and this allows then the holder of this attitude, supported by their beliefs, to sustain this hostile attitude and then perhaps engage in housing discrimination. So prejudice defined. Now, we talk, and the book was very clear, right, on how we stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination and how those dovetail. So we begin with stereotypes, and then based on those stereotypes we begin to prejudge, and based on our prejudgments then we can discriminate. So those are distinct concepts. They are not interchangeable, but they are self-supporting. So let's go back to Allport here. Prejudice defined. Ethnic prejudice is an antipathy, and that's a hostile feeling, a dislike, based on a faulty and inflexible generalization, and that's the stereotype. That these generalizations we hold are often held as possessions, and we don't like to change them or modify them. Right? It may be felt or expressed, and the feeling part I think is really important, and I'm going to hit on that in a couple modules later. Right? It may be directed towards the group as a whole, right? Or it may be directed towards an individual because of the membership in that group. It really kind of depends on the context in that regard. Now, what's the danger in acting out prejudice? Well, it yields discrimination. And this book, I think, is a landmark work. It's one of my favorites in psychology, is The Nature of Prejudice by Gordon Allport. Allport is, in fact, responding to much of what he's seen over his lifetime, but really kind of came to its logical conclusion when we observed what happened during World War II with the acting out of prejudice. And Allport's going to make a case that there's 5 steps to extermination of a group of people, that is, to genocide. And he says it begins with antilocution. And notice these 5 steps. Let's work backwards for a minute. Allport said when we look at a genocide in the world, all of these 5 steps took place, right? But it doesn't mean because we observe the first step that it will inevitably lead to a genocide. That's, you know, it doesn't work necessarily in that way. Now, this first one is a fancy word, antilocution. What the heck is antilocution? Got to know your Latin, right? The idea is anti-locution. Locute is to speak, anti to speak against. So this is talking shit about people, talking smack, right? Throwing shade, if you will. So it begins with antilocution. We start saying bad stuff about the group of people. And then this leads to avoidance. That is segregating ourselves from other people. So we want those other people in their own schools, not in our school. Or let's keep them in our neighborhood, in their own neighborhood, but don't allow them into our neighborhood. And interestingly, when you look at one of the institutions that probably does the most to support discrimination, is probably realtors when you get right down to it. They have a tremendous amount of power. They can show you a house in this neighborhood, or they can not show you a house in a given neighborhood based on your category membership and how they believe you might or might not fit in. So avoidance, let's move up the ladder. Now we move to discrimination. It's not enough to just avoid people, but now we're going to physically discriminate them. And notice all these steps led up to the Holocaust. We start talking negatively about the Jews. There was a lot of propaganda about Jews. We started avoiding them. That is, we wouldn't shop in their businesses was the deal. We would discriminate against them. Jews were taken out of the legal profession in 1930s Germany. They were not allowed to practice medicine. So all of this was to discriminate against them. And then we see the night of the broken glass, but then we see physical attacks towards these people become prevalent. Now I want you to think about what's going on in the United States right now here in 2020. We see people talking negatively about other groups. We see avoidance taking place. We obviously see discrimination. But lately, this year in 2020, we've seen an increasing number of attacks against people based on their category membership. I mean, just folks deciding, hey, I'm going to go attack this guy over there. And it's astounding, right? But this has gone on throughout our history and throughout the history of the world. And then finally, from physical attack, we go to extermination. And Allport doesn't have good news for us. At least his opinion is not good. But unfortunately, the fateful progression is, in this century, growing in frequency. And we've seen the Armenian Holocaust. We've seen the Cambodian Holocaust. We've seen the Holocaust directed towards the Jews. We saw Stalin literally starve to death, 10 million Ukrainians. The Hutus versus the Tutsis in Rwanda. We see these exterminations take place again and again and again. And there's no reason to believe we won't see just as many or more in the 21st century. So this ties into discussion board 5, if you will. It's an opportunity to explore your own use of categories. So please pay attention to how categories can be useful and detrimental. We return to the concept here of mindfulness, that is paying attention to the categories we use, how we place people into categories. In this case, as awareness of the structure of our mind, its reliance on categorization, right, is helping or hurting us function in the world. So we take a step back, we look at ourselves as the object of analysis, particularly we look at ourselves in terms of the way we use categories, right? What are our go-to categories and how do we use them, right? And that's discussion board 5. It won't require a response. And then assignment 7, obviously the assignment is fully fleshed out in Carmen, so this is just kind of a smattering of tying the lecture to the assignment. Number 1, I find myself using a stereotype and I realize it has negative consequences. I understand that stereotyping, right, is automatic, it's largely culturally generated, it's learned, and it is a bitch to undo. We may not want a stereotype, but our culture has caused us to use this process because we learn as through culture as the mechanism of teaching. It's a bitch to undo, right? Especially if we're tied to our stereotypes, if we believe them, have a strong belief system supporting them, our beliefs are possessions, they're valuable because they're our beliefs, right? So to undo this, from this point, what are 3 things from the text or the lecture that you can do to begin to disconfirm the stereotype? And please briefly explain each. So as it says, we're going to maybe run about 3 paragraphs on this. Anyway, I want you to explore how you use categories, but especially how you use categories in terms of stereotypes, that is, person categories. And hopefully we can get to the point where Allport's prediction of those 5 steps towards genocide actually decrease in frequency rather than increase in frequency, because wouldn't all of us like to think that human beings are better than that when you get right down to it? So, the end for now, and see you when we come back on 3.2.